We've been speaking about brain-computer interface stuff. I thought it was worth addressing the controller question. So I'm not addressing hand tracking as it currently is in headsets. I'm addressing hand tracking as it will be in the next 5 years. So that is, to recap, we're going to see better hand tracking models from on the headset tracking, to be expected. But we're also going to see bracelet designs where you actually have higher speed tracking. So the reason that's really useful, as I said before, with sensor fusion, not all your sensors come through at the same speed. Something like an accelerometer can be sampled at a much higher sample rate, much faster, so the latencies on that much lower. So by putting on bracelets and things like that, we can actually get the wrist movements much faster. We can track the object much faster. Now I'm talking about once we have cameras on the wrists, then we can infer hand position much better. And I am going to be throwing a bit of BCI into the discussion into the mix. But then let's compare against current things on the market. I obviously can't talk about future stuff as much, but it's all pretty tangential and it all blows out. The points all stay the same. Right. Start off with the old boy. So I really like the Move controller in the sense that it is asymmetrical. So it's not asymmetrical, it's symmetrical. So you can pick up either side, left hand or right hand. That has its downsides and its upsides, but it's there. This is a good representation of the wand design. I don't have the HTC Vive wand anymore. I got rid of that kit ages ago. But it's a good representative of it. Realistically, two main inputs, the top and the trigger. The bumper and the trigger, though these small buttons, we'll get back to why they're super important, and their inclusion is super important, improves the point. But it's there, it's got pretty decent tracking, very decent if you think that it started out with the iTwins all being retrofitted. And then you've got probably the dominant design at the moment, which is the touch controller. The basic thing here is you've got your two buttons, and then you've got your analog stick with clicks, and then you've got your trigger and your grip. Interesting. The other addition that came in, I think before this controller, if I recall, is the introduction of capacitive sensors to figure out if you're touching a thing, but asymmetrical, so no confusion between right and left. And then my personal favorite at the moment, Knuckles controllers, which you can open your hand, no worries about dropping. Again, fairly standardized, two buttons and a stick, and a grip button, which is the actual that, and then trigger itself. And then we have the touchpad thing in addition to the analog stick. But that being said, modern controller design, much like old school gamepads, is coming to some sort of agreement. There's some deviation here and there, but we're converging fast. And that fast convergence, simply put, is the first thing I want to address, is that there is a huge advantage in hand tracking in that we know what the parameters of the human hand are. It's a bit ableist because, some people miss a finger, some people have limited mobility in some fingers and things like that. So there is a whole ableism angle there of, if you design, for instance, your UI to work with a snap, not everyone can snap their fingers. It's a thing. However, the amount of people who have a consistent vocab of hand interactions versus consistency between these controllers, the hand really has consistency going for it in a big way. So that's a huge benefit, and one of the reasons why I think hands will be very dominant as a mainstream form of input. Additionally, the other thing with hands is they never run out of batteries. Yes, if we introduce wrist bracelets or anything like that, there is the potential of those running out of batteries. But the other nice thing is that hands have a sliding scale of quality, right? So the thing with hands input is, if we use current methods, i.e. no bracelet, purely off tracking cameras and stuff, it works, but it's lower fidelity. Then if we go up to a bracelet, it's slightly higher fidelity. Then we go up to like a full force feedback glove, we've got the highest fidelity. So we have a system there that scales quite nicely. I should hasten to add though, most VR glove designs would not allow you to snap your fingers. They're just a bit too restrictive. Their inputs aren't quite there. There's all kinds of issues there. So it's not like you have the full range of motion there, which is interesting. And that's the other thing. Even within the next 5 years, we're going to have a lot of imprecision in hand controllers. So, for example, in the Oculus, you do a lot of this kind of gesture because it's very obvious and easy to pick out a pointer. And then you do, I think it's that gesture if I recall, touching like that, because those, again, quite easy to detect, finger taps. But, you know, you're not talking about like the difference between like Open Palm and Vulkan. You know, so these are the like the nuances we aren't quite gonna get. But the bigger issue with hand controllers, other than that general imprecision, is the lack of physical acknowledgement of your action. So the snap, which I actually really like as an input, has this great acknowledgement because there is an auditory sound, but there's also like you hit the skin there. Likewise with the taps, you hit the skin there, which is I think one of the main reasons why we've defaulted to them as good UX. Likewise, if you're interacting hand to hand, we don't do many hand-to-hand interactions at the moment in systems we design, mostly because the tracking solutions fall apart. It will be solved partly with wrist, partly with BCI and some other stuff and just development in there. But yes, you've hit the nail on the head, Coates. Physical acknowledgement is why we like buttons. So that is something we will see in the future, but hand tracking, generally speaking, I think we can safely say is going to be the mainstream input, much like keyboard and mouse is the mainstream input now, but is not going to be the go-to gaming input, even less so than keyboard and mouse, because keyboard and mouse you can still game on quite, you know, it's still a very good gaming setup. It's different to a gamepad, but it's still very good. That being said, I think hands will be the dominant input just for all the reasons I've listed there. They're very easy to track and build out on. Everyone has them. Yes, it's ableist to say that, but you're going to get a lot more consistency in hand input than you will in, I think, the gamepad space. I'm not going to get into the keyboard and mouse better than gamepad thing. I think there's a lot of acknowledgements why a gamepad with a gyro is actually, in most cases, for gaming inputs, a better input. There are obviously exceptions, but yes, that's I think where we are at the moment, because the real thing that the other than gyros, which huge use, and a limited vocab of buttons, which is consistent, we have more analog input. We have the trigger and we have the sticks as well. Very good. Whereas with the keyboard and mouse, we only rarely have the mouse. I kind of hate the keyboard and the mouse as an input system. It's got a very high vocab on the keyboard itself, but there's not much humanness to the input. I think that's really held back computer UX design for a very long time. However, we don't have this problem so much with the controllers yet. Now, the Move controller, a lot of people give it a lot of hate for not having an analog stick on it. Analog sticks are useful, but I think their dominance at the moment in people's minds mostly comes from the historical precedent of gamepads. Bit unfortunate, but I think, you know, much the way so much of modern design is determined by the width of a horse's arse, because legacy of cart tracks and roads and rails, and then just how that legacy continues, I think we are going to be somewhat stuck with the analog stick. In many ways, I like the analog stick, but in many ways I actually prefer tracking volumes, capacitive volumes and things like that. However, focusing on this, remember how I said these small buttons were almost thrown in as a concession. They're not very ergonomic. You know, everyone who works with the Move controllers kind of hates them. But that expanded vocab meant that when we came to the PlayStation VR era, this actually had enough of a vocab to be usable. An interesting thing that also this showed us, because they're symmetrical in design, which means you don't know if you're holding your left and right hand, great in so many ways. Terrible in the sense of the brain maps relative controls easier. So inner versus outer rather than left versus right on the different hands, which is a thing. So yeah, that was a problem for us, because obviously the square symbol is different in your left and right hand because your brain thinks in terms of inner and outer. Right. So there's that. However, with the Knuckles and the touch controller, you'll notice they both use the AB reference because there's no patent or design on AB symbology. The other useful thing, by the way, is they both have A and B in the same place. It was always a problem back in the day with Nintendo and Sega and everyone. Like, they all flipped their controller design slightly more. I think to the horse's ass discussion, you're going to see a lot more standardization in the controller space. It actually disappoints me a little bit how much standardization you're going to see in the VR controller space. But it's something we're going to see. I think you'll see a large amount of standardization with much how the DualSense had that little bit of extra juice in it with the adaptive trigger, and the Knuckles has that extra bit of juice in it with this touchpad here and the full finger tracking. You're going to see little additions like that, but the primary vocab, I think, has now been set at an analog stick and 2 buttons, and the buttons haven't gone left to right of the analog stick. A lot of that discussion is to do with just the limited mobility of your thumb. We've discovered that there's a relatively limited mobility. Ooh, there is another controller we haven't mentioned, by the way, talking about physical acknowledgement controllers. There's a really good argument for why hand tracking will not be the be-all and end-all. That is the tablet pen. We know we can get more precision out of a pen or a pencil versus finger painting, say. It's just something we know we can do. Even with the best touch sensors, we know that finger painting is not as precise because the human, we're naturally really good as humans at using tool extension in our brain model. So that Wacom pen, we already know Wacom's worked on a VR tracked pen. There are some other VR tracked pens out there, some of which use the Lighthouse, some of which use light tracking. So the pen is, I think, also going to be a helpful aid because you just have more fidelity with a pen, and it's something that people are used to from real life, so it tracks over quite well. So we know that we know the power of button acknowledgement, right? You know that if you push the A button has been pushed. And you get a clicky sound, really useful. And yeah, with the triggers, we get that analog input. The other big addition that happened to controllers is capacitive touch. Can be really shitty capacitive touch, by the way, which drops its cost significantly. But the capacitive touch basically gives us a mouse over state. It gives us a hover state if we're touching the buttons. This is really good for hand tracking generally, but it's also good for soft acknowledgement, figuring out if the person is on the trigger or not on the trigger, or if on the thumbstick, not on the thumbstick, things like that. Which gives us a lot of UX language. That's a huge upgrade. I can't talk too much about PlayStation stuff because obviously it's all NDA. I'm no longer at PlayStation, but it'll be at NDA for a while. But yeah, so I can't talk about too much about the controller stuff. But anyway, sorry, my brain's resetting there and I'm backtracking my brain out that alley, so I don't talk about NDA. However, that being said, capacitive touch on here, very, very useful. But you'll notice for the Oculus controller, there is a grip button that's a physical button there. Much simpler, but it also means you can't flip the bird, which sucks. Whereas when you go to the Knuckles, you get that full hand tracking. And you do get a physical squeeze pressure sensor in there. So there is if you need to tie, pull the pin on a grenade to a button, you can tie to that. It is a more commonly accidental push. It's actually a really funny thing. Oculus's V1 controller, I think it was the B button, was pretty much unusable in most games because of how many times it got accidental presses. A similar problem is happening with the Knuckles with grip sensors. They're reliable, but they're not fully reliable because that acknowledgement isn't quite there. And kind of proves out the point. Also, the other problem with hand trackers like this, they're good. They're very good. But the amount of times where you will lift this finger, say, or you'll lift these 2 fingers and it won't quite lift the right fingers because it's based on finger position. It's just training and stuff. So if your hand rests in an unusual way or you've fastened the strap in an unusual way, it's there. You can calibrate your brain to it a bit, but then you get into the problems we're having with hand tracking. But yeah, the other thing I really love about the Knuckles is the ability to let go like that. That's hugely powerful. It comes with the additional friction of putting on a wrist strap, but You know, it's not a small amount of, it's not a huge amount of friction compared to putting on your headset and stuff, and the joy of being able to, you know, put that stuff down. The only downside is you can't pick up, you can't hold a cup of coffee like that. You can do the extended fingers thing like that. You can, and that's how I get drunk in VR, kids. But yeah, the Knuckles, they have that advantage. The touchpad, really useful. Not a lot of games use it because, again, that thing of all the controllers are going to want to solidify. But the nice thing is actually, because not many games use it, you can actually map a lot of overlays and additional controllers to this, so this feels like a bit of a superpower, which is nice. It's not going to be as big a thing on consoles and on vertical platforms like the Quest, but I think on PC there's these little bit of extra touch, much like how most people have like a 2-button mouse was the norm for the longest time, and then 3 buttons was like a superpower, and then 3 buttons with a mouse wheel, and then you've got like programmable mice with like 5 buttons or whatever. I think you're going to see some of that in specifically PC controller design. But yeah, this is just really powerful because we get that acknowledgement, we get that mouse over state. The vibration motors, really good. The DualSense is obviously the new standard. I think everyone agrees the DualSense is probably the best vibration motor out there at the moment. But between cell phones and between some other developments, our haptic feedback stuff is really improving. BCI obviously will be the end point there. The other thing I want to mention is, other than just tracking volumes for things, you also get capacitive touch areas that aren't buttons. So it's hard to see, but do you see that little circle there by the A and B button? That is just another capacitive sensor to basically detect if your thumb is off to the side there. Not a button, but it's a rest area for your thumb. It's not super comfortable rest area, but it's there. Better than HD Rumble. I forget who uses the brand name HD Rumble. If I was to rate Rumble feedback systems, like the Joy-Cons were a huge leap up, and they were, to my knowledge, the first broadly commercially available linear actuator, which is the new style of design, because the old thing was like a rotation. If you open like any controller before the Joy-Cons, you basically find this lopsided volume which we rotate with an engine. Very slow to spin up, gives you quite a big do-do-do-do, but also quite battery intensive. The linear actuator thing is a much more elegant sort of MEMS based system. Joy-Cons use them very successfully. Then we saw them in the HTC Vive, and then the second or third generation Oculus controller, I think, implemented them, as did the Knuckles to a better extent, and then the DualSense has taken that to, I think, the next level. I think the DualSense, everyone agrees, is kind of the peak of that, and that's really nice because that's at the point where you're treating the Rumble almost like a speaker. But yeah, we're not going to focus on haptics at the moment because that's a whole another discussion. We're focusing on the hands versus controllers and where do we kind of see those. I think Quest is ahead of the game here, in the sense of you can put on a Quest and you can use your hands and you can navigate stuff, and then you can pick up the touch controller immediately, because that's the other nice thing. And when you're in VR, you can spot your controllers, pick them up immediately, and transition. Something I was very fond of in Dreams that we did really well is switching between the DS4 and the Move controllers. Pretty seamless, and there was definitely things you wanted to use the DS4 for, and definitely things you wanted to use the Move controllers for. I suppose that brings us to touch keyboards and tracked keyboards. There are a few UXs on tracked keyboards. Obviously touch typing, you can just touch type, but mice, we can just say mice are dead in VR. There's no real good analogy for a mouse. I think tablets and surfaces, like interacting with surfaces. So for example, if I come here and I do that on the surface, I think there is valid use case for that, which is the equivalent of a mouse in many ways, and including the sort of swiping on a surface, which again, equivalent of a mouse swipe. But keyboards are really useful because keyboards are 101 discrete keys, I believe. It's handy. It's very handy. Yeah. Again, it's one of those things that you can easily overlook. So I remember back in the early 2000s, the first time I used a laser keyboard. So this is a short throw laser projector you put on a desk, and projects out a laser light keyboard, and you touch and type on it. And it meant you had no travel on the keys because you're just touching on wood, but it worked. It didn't often misregister a key. It would occasionally. It was frustrating, but less typo mistakes than say a mobile phone keyboard. But the real problem was it really hurt your fingers. It really hurt your fingers. You compare that to a keyboard with a nice travel time, a nice key response. Yeah, mechanical keyboard users, yeah. That is it's a pleasurable thing. And if you're going to spend, say, 8 hours of your day working on an interface, that interface has to feel comfortable and low energy. Because that's the other thing, is we don't want to be hand waving and burning calories doing basic inputs. Humans are lazy. Humans optimize for laziness. So yeah, I don't think we're going to be seeing those kind of hand inputs where we're like air typing. Air typing just feels horrible. You can air type now. You need to go with a non-standard keyboard layout. Like you need to go with the split keyboard layout, and you need to give yourself a bit more room to really get the best out of it, air typing. I've played with some nice air typing prototypes, but they're compromised. They're still significantly worse than a keyboard input. And I have seen the solution of putting like an HTC Vive tracker, or just in software defining where your keyboard is, and then obviously once your hands are on the keys, the keys themselves give you guidance to some extent, so you don't need a huge amount. It works. It's just not great. It's not great. But yeah, where do I think we'll be in 5 years? 5 years time, I think, as I say, bracelets, pretty much the norm. Bracelets, or just no accessories at all to track. Pretty much the norm. I think for anything social, or anything that is not, shall we say, how do we put this? Anything that is not skill oriented, anything that is not productivity oriented, I think the hands will be the dominant inputs, right? So if you're looking at a VR chat, if you're looking at browsing the web, if you're looking at, honestly, the bulk of what people do on computers, hands will be the input. There's no doubt. The moment you need productivity or gaming, though, people will be reaching for controllers. Much like how, which is a smaller number than people think, much like how with how many people who own a Switch own the Pro Controller, right? Smaller numbers than you think, because for most people, taking the two Joy-Cons is enough, right? It's not quite a perfect analogy, but it tracks about to there. Your college roommate who doesn't game as much, who plays Candy Crush or whatever, goes onto VR socials, spaces and things like that, they're going to rely almost entirely on hand tracking. No gloves, because gloves are a pain in the neck. Then you're going to get your equivalent of a PC gamer who's going to be using like haptic glove situations in there. Likewise, in an office situation or just a mid-tier user, you may get bracelet situations. But for gaming, you are, I think, going to converge on either this or this. And the reason I'm torn is, if you're going between hand and not hand, this is easier to pick up and put down. And that's a big deal. That's a huge deal. If you're going between hand and not hand, that's a winner. However, if you're not flipping all the time, that is really powerful. And the other nice thing about this, by the way, is I can see a version of the Knuckles that is more hand-friendly, as in we don't feel the need to put the controller down. So yeah, that's kind of where we are, inputs, and that's kind of most of what I wanted to go through. Oh yes, tablet inputs and pen inputs. We are going to see a lot more tracked pens, not only spatially tracked, but as I say, flat on surfaces, VR stuff. It's just really useful. Like, we know how to use a pen, and tracking a pen in XR is not super hard. Also, if you're interested in this space, by the way, there's a wonderful Twitter account. He's been doing these experiments for well over a year. There we go, Push Matrix. How can I forget his Twitter? He's got such a good Twitter name. Yeah, if you are interested in the UX of hand tracking and like what you can do with hands in VR, that is a very good Twitter account to check out. Mechanical keyboard. Using the Move controller on the PS4 keyboard is quite an experience. Mostly because there was never a lot of love given to ways you can do typing with the Move controller. There are better ways. There are interesting ways you can do things. I think the biggest takeaway for me from the PS4 generation is how good gyro typing was. Gyro typing is very, very good. Oh, that's the other thing I didn't mention. Voice input. Subvocalizational voice input. Big deal. If you play in a PS5 game, you can just do voice keyboard. Most VR platforms have voice typing. That eliminates a lot of the keyboard friction that we have. You don't kind of want to use voice typing when you're coding or being productive in that sense, so there's a barrier there. Do I think that barrier is going to be crossed in the near future? Don't know. I don't think so. Not in 5 years. Not in the 5-year window. In the sense of there's still... Do you know how long it took for people to move, like programmers, to move from console interfaces to window interfaces? Like, developers will be slow to adapt. So I think we will see some stuff happening there, but I think voice input for the casual, for the developer and for the programmer, I think keyboards and 2D interfaces kind of stick around. Laser projection keyboards, yeah, they had a bit of a renaissance during the like VR funding phase, but yeah, they're not great. They're not great. I actually prefer touch typing, air typing versus the laser keyboard design. Just give me an input to laser. You see, that is shitty thinking, because you're throwing away that spatial input. It's another thing I see also in VR chat, where they rely on the laser pointer interface stuff. It has its place, but I think there's definitely, when you're doing UX design, there's definitely like a fallback, like, oh fuck, I give up interface, and that's usually falling back on all the paradigms. The laser pointer in VR design I see as the I give up design, where you just fall back to a 2D design. So yeah, no, I'm not a huge fan of that, especially because there's so much you can gain from having 3D interfaces. Things like, you know, grabbing knobs and pushing buttons in at certain depths and things like that. They require nuance, they require polish, but they're very doable. Yes, there have been, mostly for people with, so if you're interested in novel keyboard design, look at assistive technologies, i.e. things that have been made for people with injuries or handicaps. There's been a lot of different kinds of typing technologies for those kind of things. And there's been a lot of sort of AI experiments and stuff. Chorded keyboards is the concept you want to look into. Chorded keyboards is basically, so a keyboard chord is something like Control A, Control C, doing something different than if you do Control C, Control A. It's chording like a guitar chord. It's linking up inputs in an order, usually with a modifier key. So, like, if we treat the thumb as the shift button, and we go like duk duk duk, and like you need 3 taps to do an input, then what we could say is we could have 4 primary inputs, right? Like, say those are like our 4 primary inputs. And then we could put our thumb down, and then we could say a valid input when your thumb is down is 2 or more presses or 3 or more presses. At which point, instead of having 4 inputs here, if you say that you need 2 inputs, it'll be 4 times 3, it'll be 12 keys that you have. And if you say you need 3 inputs, it'll be 4 times 3 times 2, unless you can double tap. If you can double tap, then it'll be 4 times 4 or 4 times 4 times 4. So that's the difference there. So yeah, you could, as I say, if you, and you can do those kind of designs on here. Also, we didn't really talk about something that Dreams does, which I think is amazing, which is the bashing stuff there. I think that is something we will see more of in physical UX design stuff. We're not seeing a ton of it at the moment in hand tracking space, because, as I say, the moment you bring your hands together, hand tracking just blows up at the moment. I would like to see more of it in VR games. We have very good solid proprioception. So the idea is that if I close my eyes, I can still clap my hands, I can tap my ear, tap the top of my head, tap my chin. These are we know where our body is, and because we've got solid head tracking, you can do these kind of things. Again, tracking volumes are limited, so the way things work at the moment, if you tap like that, it'll be problematic to track because you lose hand tracking here usually. But yeah, those kind of inputs, I think we will see more of that. If you're interested in this kind of input, especially in regards to BCI, a good book to read that's fiction, there's better non-fiction books to read, but a good fictional book I think that does this quite well is Vannevar Burs's Rainbow's End. He talks about, I forget the term he uses for it, but it's basically the clothes that people wear are wearables and they have sensors in. And old people don't adapt to them as much because they use the old design paradigms. But younger kids learn to twitch muscles to basically do interactions, and the kind of corded interactions I'm talking about there. So yeah, like I think doing like touching your hand, like doing like a swipe on your hand like that, and doing those kind of motions when we solve the hand interface problem, which is why I think so much research is going into it. Those kind of interactions open up in interesting ways. However, that being said, I'm disappointed with how many people in normal sort of controller space aren't doing the bashing stuff that the Move controllers do in Dreams. I think Dreams really nails how useful those can be. What I have seen a lot of in VR games has been like head shortcuts and shoulder shortcuts. That's the other thing, is people often say like put something around your back. That's super imprecise, right? Because it's not like sheathing a sword on your back. First of all, it's not something that happened in real life much. But second of all, people don't have a solid point of reference. But if you say to people, put your hand to your right ear, or if you say to people, put your hand to your chin or whatever, those are things people can relate to as inputs. So I think there's some confusion there, but really, really good. So unless there's any other questions, I'm probably going to wrap that. VR hairdressers. It's been done. It's really cool. It's an interesting space. If you look at that Push Matrix account, he did some VR hairdressing stuff. There's also been some other VR hairdressing stuff. Going the extra mile for the pun. I respect that. Yeah. That being said, take care everyone. I hope you enjoyed these little VR chats. I haven't been streaming on the regular because I've been busy and I haven't felt the need to. That being said, I have enjoyed doing these little chats, and see you when I see you. Bye bye now.